Yeah. So I'm going to be sitting down. If anybody needs to shift their bodies into space, whatever they need or want, please do. I also want to, before I start, just do a quick access check. There are going to be some images, but it's mostly text on the screen, and I'll be speaking. Is this volume okay for folks, or is there anyone who needs me to speak up a little bit? Anybody who will need image descriptions, I can do image descriptions. Just make yourself known. And if anybody doesn't want to stare at a screen anymore and prefers to read along with me, I print out the slides, you can come sit next to me. And also feel free to leave or shift, again, however you need. So thank you, everyone, for sticking around. I know energy has waned on my end, but also I can share it with everyone else. So we're just going to go through this and think about how together we can engage disabled audiences in conversations around matters of disability, identity, and experience. When I say conversations, I mean, yes, one-on-one, I mean in programs with our groups that come here, but also this kind of grand conversation of what is the discourse that we are having in our culture. It's important for me to frame this research in telling everyone that it's steeped in disability studies, which is, in the realm of academia, a newer field, and it's really led by disabled folks and scholars right now. And so I'm going to share just a couple of theories or points that helped me kind of work through all this. It's important to understand that disability, and the way I'm going to be speaking about it, is rooted in the social model of disability, which claims that it's the structures in our society that we create, that we build, that disable people, that exclude people from having equal opportunities. And so a really plain example that I think occurs most visibly in our society are steps, right? We think about how steps are kind of a given when we build buildings or spaces, but actually who is that leaving out? And I've just brought two examples of how it's very obvious to disabled folks. And here are two disabled artists who make work addressing that. Here we have Shannon Finnegan, who's in this gray jumpsuit over here, with a whole bunch of disabled folks and non-disabled folks for her Anti-Stairs Club Lounge protest action against the vessel, which is that really disgusting structure right behind there, which another disabled artist and scholar, Kevin Gopkin, kind of claims as this monument to ableism. So anyway, and that piece over there was in a group show that both Shannon and I just showed in, that was reviewed in the New York Times and just closed. And this is by Jacqueline Ramin, who's an artist from LA. And this is an image of her video piece where she actually has taken a lot of time to sit in front of gallery spaces in LA that she can't access. Another theory is this idea of epistemic invalidation. So it's theory, but it's also just a truism in the way a lot of disabled people experience engagement in the world around knowledge. So epistemic invalidation, epistemic means of or relating to knowledge or the conditions for acquiring it. And Claire Pankett notes that in art education specifically, and in museum spaces, it's most often a non-disabled educator teaching disabled groups. And so what happens there's this person who has all the knowledge and is supposed to be giving it to these disabled people. And what that does is also invalidates their own knowledge through their embodiment and through their experiences and their minds. And so it's important for me to note that in this research and in me being here as one of or the only publicly and politically identified, self-identified disabled person working in the education division, and in most of the museum, that I have had opportunities, or me being here is an opportunity to validate disabled epistemic knowledge. Here we have an image of myself speaking and introducing a program that I helped to organize with the Art and Disability Residency and the public programs team here on art, labor, and disability. And we see a whole group of people who are interested in this, and all the people who are sharing this knowledge are disabled people. So it's possible. Why is this relevant? Well, disabled people come to visit the museum. And we have access programs, which, as Lance Reuter, my supervisor and the access programs coordinator, shares the definition, is that access programs are time and space-based strategies for disabled people to come to the museum and, in the best-case scenario, engage with all the museum has to offer. And here we have just an image of the first ever ASL tour to come through the museum, and it was in the Frida Kahlo. So to highlight just further that it's actually not just these ideas that I'm coming up with, but that it's in the mandate of the museum. And here we have in the value statement in bold, it says, our mandate is to contribute to the advancement of society with a commitment to true connectedness and diversity. And so if it's a mandate, we have to be committed. And it's to think broadly of what diversity really means here. So we're gonna critique that a little bit. It's also relevant because our exhibitions that we have in this museum talk about disability. I chose to do this whole research as a case study within the Frida Kahlo Appearances Can Be Deceiving exhibition for a number of reasons, but mainly this was a long-running special exhibition that we had here. And as the curator, Catherine Mars, one of the curators of the show, who's also here, is rethinking how disability is being spoken about. So the exhibition is titled after a drawing by Kahlo, in which she makes visible the disability that her striking Carolina skirts and blouses covered. The show expands our understanding of Kahlo by revealing the unique power behind the ways she presented herself in the world and depicted herself in the art. In my early stages of the fellowship, we were introduced to the diversity, equity, and inclusion plan that the museum is working through, led by Kiana Hendricks. And we see over here the responses that people were giving in one of our all-staff meetings when they were thinking of what do we need the most growth. Ability, or I'd like to just amend that to disability, is actually a value that people are already thinking of along similar lines with race and religion. And so people are thinking better about how do we actually engage that. And here we also see some concerns. Someone writes, how to talk about disability representation without much representation. So these are things that I'm not the only one thinking about. These are coming from a wider range of our staff here. Some questions that arose from this research, and also in speaking with other educators who work in access programs, non-disabled educators, and we were thinking about this big question, and we asked, is there a responsibility from the museum side to engage our disabled audiences in conversations of disability identity and experience in our programs? And if yes, is doing so unfairly essentializing the disabled audiences attending access programs? The methods that I took for this case study research project was to, again, steep myself within the knowledge that is being created and shared by disabled people within the disability studies field, and also within art and art education museum studies. I also observed two of the access programs that had a chance to go into the Frida Kahlo exhibition, one of which I was one of the lead educators on, which was a our Brooklyn Afternoons program for older adults with memory loss and their care partners. And the other program was the verbal description and touch tour for blind folks or those with low vision. And for that one, I was supporting more in just being there as one of the people working in the program. So that was taught by another educator who's non-disabled. So, and besides for those, I also made a point to interview 8 people who identify as disabled, who I know personally, who identify as disabled and work within the arts as artists, as educators, as activists. And it was important for me to have them come in and go into the exhibition and hear from them what they thought, along with the observations of the larger access programs, because that's actually more representative of what disability and disability communities are in our country. Not everyone identifies as disabled, and so we don't put that on the people who come on the access programs. So I also wanted to make sure that people who self-identify were also being included. And so we had those were some methods that I was using. Some trends in the data and led to findings were in these categories of design accessibility of exhibitions, that representation matters, that there are opportunities for personal connections and knowledge making, and that language is really, really integral. When it comes to the design and accessibility of exhibitions, many people commented on different aspects of the design and the accessibility in their experience going through the exhibition. And here I'm bringing out one quote from a blind visitor who says, "As a blind visitor, I found that the Frida Kahlo exhibit had a lot of interesting content that I'd be interested in learning and experiencing. Unfortunately, the exhibit does not have enough accessibility for me to enjoy the exhibit by myself. If it wasn't for my sighted partner reading the wall text and describing the words, I would have gotten virtually nothing from the exhibit." And this is important to highlight because the museum did not provide any accessibility features for that person to have the same experience as I could have as a sighted person, and it goes through a list of a lot of other people sharing things about the pathways being too narrow for them, it being overcrowded, among other things. And so if we don't address the basic access needs of individuals coming to the museum, how can we expect them to learn? Representation matters. This is a quote from a disabled artist who shared at the end of all of their thoughts with me that I keep thinking what I would have felt or learned if I had seen the exhibition as a kid. And this is a person who's had major exhibitions in New York City museums now, including Brooklyn Museum, and it really struck a chord with me, thinking that this person who I've learned from and looked up to as someone working heavily within the field, and as one of the main representatives within disability arts, that we actually are not addressing the fact that this person is an adult and is coming to that point now. And what would it have been like if they really had exposure as a kid to representation and disability? So disability representation is a way to galvanize identification of disability as not just an individual experience, but as something political and social. Here's another quote that I was just observing when on the verbal description tour within the room of the exhibit that spoke to disability more explicitly. And this person was responding to the educator and said, "As a person who grew up disabled, I know that younger people hide it and like having areas covered that might be revealing. As we get older and discover ourselves, like Frida actually displaying her disability, we are no longer hiding. It is a sort of freedom of displaying who she is and who we are." And this is a person who is an older adult who shared that this connection with them, right? They were able to come out of this experience and feel connected with their own experience. Language is really important. Another person who responded to me shared that they were thrilled to see disability named multiple times in the exhibition, and that it was echoing contemporary language that they use, that disability communities use in our everyday lives and how we actually think of ourselves. And so it's really important to think about the ways language are also these structures that in our society we create that either leave people in or leave people out or bring people in. It's also important that if educators are mostly non-disabled in museum spaces are teaching disabled audiences, that they are also aware of contemporary disability language and culture to also have more dialogue and engage in that way. So some recommendations from gathering all of this and hearing all the responses is that right, we can do it. It's definitely possible. So let's, when it comes to design and accessibility, we need more accessible design and infrastructure to accommodate the basic needs of museum visitors. And these things are corroborated by reports that have been previously submitted by Lance Reuter, my supervisor in access programs and the coordinator of access programs. So it's not just something that these people shared, it's things that have been shared over many exhibitions. Representation matters. So like I said, this idea of epistemic validation happens, and so me being here was the opportunity to continue in validation. So we need more disabled staff, and not just educators. We need educators, but we need representation in every single department. If 20% of our general population is considered disabled, that has to be represented across all the departments. And so representation means from the people you see, and also the people you don't see doing the work behind those doors. We also need increased collections and exhibitions with work by disabled artists to also have visitors be able to see themselves represented. Language. Cross-exhibition programming tours that incorporate ideas and language through different topics. And also we need more ongoing training for staff on contemporary disability culture, and in addition to accessibility training that happens not enough here. And so it has to be not just about accessibility, how to get people in, but how do we actually continue to bring people in and shift our cultures. So we need increased capacity for access programs, including more additional tours that we already offer. So the first ever ASL tours that I mentioned happened during the Frida Kahlo exhibition. It sold out immediately, so we had to add 3 more tours, all of which sold out. So it shows there's a need, there's a want, and we can do it, but we need to increase our capacity. Access programs for children, right? That quote that I brought before from that person who's engaged as an adult within the art world, really wished what they could have seen things as a kid that echoed their experiences. And we can think that in school groups, a lot of times we do have disabled children, and but that's sort of our only ways of addressing these disabled students is like in these specific gallery guided visits. So I wonder what we can do to also collaborate with teen programs, the family and youth programming, with access programs to think more broadly about what access means here. And let's have some more specific times that are open for disabled people to also counterbalance the issues of overcrowding or overstimulation, and just to have more features available. So thank you so much. I'm going to leave this up for the portion of the question and answer. And also, Millicent, if you don't mind, I printed out 25 copies. You can pass them around, you can take them or leave them. Here's a list of resources, some more knowledge that disabled people are there already giving. It's already there. And then here's a list. You have about 20 different artists who I know personally who are working within this field. And so I would say take a picture of this, take a handout. There's not really more excuses. We're here, including someone else in the room who's on this list, Jerron Herman, who has a performance coming up at the Whitney next month. So all that is to say, thank you for being here with me. We need to improve access for everyone, and also I'd be open to hearing your thoughts and questions and concerns.
Can I make a plug?
Sure.
Leah, who authored Hair Work, is reading downstairs the last pavilion for our program tonight. So, hey,
Okay, so I'm gonna Ajua and Monica. Yeah.
One of the things that to me was really exciting about this presentation, also as a non-disabled person coming to learn about the field of disability studies, one of the things that's been really exciting and enlightening to me is the ways in which this kind of social justice perspective around disability pushes the broader kind of society to grow and evolve, both in terms of how we think about capitalism and productivity within education, how it pushes our teaching practice for all people because of the unique perspective because of the unique ways in which different needs from different disability communities pushes us to evolve, both as educators, but also as workers, as all kinds of ways. And with that, one of the things that I wonder about is, it's such a broad umbrella to talk about people with disabilities, the disabilities communities. And for me, your point around representation, my mind automatically goes to the things that I'm most familiar with, right? So it's very clear to me, for example, why Black and brown young people need representation, both in terms of staff that they're encountering, also who's on the wall. So that's like the immediate kind of connection that I see. And within that, one of the ways that I see, for example, the realm of disability in a very simplistic way, there's like kind of cognitive disabilities, there's physical disabilities, and sometimes in the conversation around representation, I think that there's an immediate way of thinking about representation around physical disabilities, and I want to put out there as a question, how can we also challenge our thinking around cognitive disabilities and what it would mean to have greater representation in that regard? Because we're so steeped in a linear, academic, intellectualizing kind of mentality in terms of how we build exhibits, in terms of how we understand knowledge, and that was a huge light bulb moment for me in my teaching practice, learning from educators and also folks that are on the spectrum, and all of a sudden understanding, oh, sometimes a direct question is not actually good teaching. You know, and it was like, oh, what? Oh, really? You know, so I'm just wondering, I'm just putting that out there because I wonder what it would actually mean to push this question of representation. Yes, in terms of physical disabilities, but also I'm interested in thinking, wrestling with the idea of diversity and inclusion around cognitive disabilities as well.
I know that once a month, I just finished yesterday one of my last program with a group of 4 individuals who are developmentally disabled and blind or are visually impaired. And one of the things that we do is we always have to touch things, and we got permission to touch artwork yesterday. And if we can start to think also like more broadly, it's not just for those people, right? If we like, oh, everyone has touch, everyone has something to touch. Touch is a knowledge maker. And something else I learned from deaf-blind artist, John, do you remember the name of the artist?
John Lee Clark.
John Lee Clark, who was sharing that protactile language is the way that the deaf-blind community interacts, and was shifting my way of thinking about touch as a mode of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And we're so, right, in our vocabulary earlier, it's like, please respect the art, like no touching, right? And we say that all the time. Let's start to think about how we are putting value on objects more than people, and to really start to think what aesthetics actually can shift in that way too. So in my own art practice and others, we are thinking about that. Disabled artists are doing that work already, and so I'm not joking, this is the resource. All these people should be hired and paid. There's still laws. There's the sub-minimum wage law that makes it legal for employers to pay disabled folks under minimum wage based on the employer's understanding of what productivity means and how those people are engaging with their notion of productivity. So when I talk about matters of disability identity and experience and these conversations, it's literally life or death. Like, this isn't about just social justice. This is like people's lives. So I would encourage us to think broadly about like how we look at art, how we experience art, what art we think is valuable, how we think of value, and how we think of productivity. And so those are sort of my thoughts in relation to that. Yeah. And things are not always visible, so that's really important to bring that up. We don't know all the time, so we need to check in a lot more. Yes, Monica, and then you wanted to share something. Great.
Thank you so much, Ezra. Thank you, like I said earlier, for crafting this in a way that, connecting it to the theory to the concrete work that you did. Also, thank you. I've learned a lot just working with you this year and our conversations and learning a lot more about disability and disability studies. So I know that I feel like that knowledge, you're talking about training, and I think that we could all benefit from that kind of knowledge. So I have one thing that's more of a statement and one for everybody, I think, and maybe a question that you can answer, and then another one that's a question. So the one that's a question is one of your recommendations was cross-exhibition programming tours. So that was my question. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is piggybacking a little bit on what Ajo was talking about, and one, like the invisible, not just like cognitive, but what is it, invisible disability, and learning about that, and maybe it's a question about how do we do that, or the language around how we address that. But something you said, or one of your recommendations, to have hours where we, that are for disabled audiences. And it made me think about the museum and that it is accessible for a very particular kind. Like, I'm thinking about the glass pavilion and the lobby in the morning when we're doing welcoming GGBs and stuff, and then suddenly the music comes on, and it's just oh my god, I can't hear. It's so overstimulating. And then so many spaces in the museum, because of echoing, things like that, are just really loud. And so how do we make those decisions between, well, music is going to make some people feel comfortable and welcoming, while other people it's just so way too much. So I don't know if it's a statement or a question, but there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important to note that we have access programs that are these more specific times that are guided, and I think it's about options, right? So it's saying you can come when it's blasting music if that's good for you. You can also come when it's not going to be blasting music. So I think it's not about either or. It's how do we just introduce more, and that's kind of in our capacity to. So options is always my kind of go-to as access or give options. And we can talk more, but I'd like to close with you. I don't know your name.
Very good. It's just a general question with regard to this area in terms of does the ADA have any purview over, I guess, the accessibility for people with disabilities?
Yeah, the ADA. Sure. The Americans with Disabilities Act has, I think, more or less given institutions just this bare minimum. We comply, but we're not shifting culture. So I think ADA doesn't have jurisdiction over thinking about things this way. And what it does is it actually stops a lot of people from moving past just compliance. And so they're we're accessible.
You have the means to come in and enjoy, but you really, to get into the physical facility, you cannot. You need to be disabled in terms of not taking the full wealth of what you need.
Let's take the hypothetical, how we've constructed our society, this ideal white, able-bodied male, right, mid-age, young, fit, right? If that's the norm, we need to also break that down and to think about it's not if they can get into space and everything's built for them, who is it not being built for? And I think that's kind of the shift. And we're talking about not anything that we can solve tomorrow, but it's about how do we implement something that builds, or actually they'll say deconstructs or breaks what we already have. That's more where I'm heading towards. It's a feat or a thing for a lot of work, but this is the work because it's accessibility. I think what Tiara mentioned and Brian mentioned is thinking about access in this broader terms of it's yes, we have to think specifically about disabled audiences, but it's also economic accessibility. It's if people feel they're going to be policed just because of the way they look when they come in. That's all those things are intersected and connected. So I think it's about understanding that also. Yeah, it's a lot of work. I'm not saying this is easy, but with your permission and your commitments, I think we can change things. So thank you again.
Fellows, a big round of applause. Thank you so much for being here. We still have Sherry join us in the anteroom here, so we can toast the fellows for all their great work. Thank you so much.
This is just the water. behind all of this. And thank you for your countless hours and all of the thoughtful work that you do with all of it.
And I feel like every year the game goes up. Dalila has been really instrumental in that. She's brought in a level of care and attention and rigor that is really amazing and astounding to behold. So thank you, Dalila, for all your tireless hours of